Usually, when a massive project fails, it's loud. It's a spectacle.
Oh, absolutely.
You think about WeWork or FTX or even going way back to Enron.
Yeah.
There are bankruptcies, court dates. You see CEOs crying on television.
Right.
We're sort of conditioned to expect a crash. You see the glass breaking. You see the for sale sign on the headquarters. It satisfies this narrative itch we have, the rise and the fall.
It's cinematic, and we like the crash because it's a definitive ending. It tells us what went wrong, who's to blame. But the reality of modern economics, especially at the intersection of government and large-scale infrastructure, most failures aren't explosions.
No.
They're evaporations.
And that is exactly what we are digging into today. We're looking at the mechanics of silence. Specifically, we are doing a deep dive into the strange, quiet life and death of Project Meridian.
Project Meridian, a name that I would guess, statistically speaking, none of our listeners have thought about in at least 4 years.
If they ever even knew it existed at all. But looking at the source material you pulled, this wasn't some backroom sketch. This was a titan.
It was huge.
We're talking about a transatlantic energy initiative that ran for a full decade, from 2012 to 2022. It had steady funding, approved budgets, government backing.
And then it didn't explode. It didn't get canceled in some big scandal. It just stopped being there.
That's the mystery I want to try and solve today. The central tension here isn't about corruption or fraud. It's about erasure versus failure.
Yes.
Because even when things fail, there's paperwork. There's a tombstone, a final audit that says, we messed up, here's how much we lost. But with Project Meridian, we have a ghost.
And that distinction is vital. Failure is an outcome. It's a result. Erasure is a process. It's an active bureaucratic step taken to remove the history of that outcome.
Okay.
So our mission today is to trace the life cycle of this silent document from its very loud, very expensive beginning to its complete bureaucratic disappearance. We need to understand how you make $4.2 billion of public investment just vanish.
Let's start with that number, $4.2 billion. Because the story, it doesn't start in the shadows. It starts with a ribbon-cutting ceremony.
It starts in the absolute spotlight. We go back to the sources from late 2011, early 2012. The launch of Project Meridian was everywhere. It was the golden era of green infrastructure optimism.
I was looking at a press release from the Department of Energy dated March 12, 2012. They didn't just call it a project, they call it the backbone of future grid resilience.
The language was incredibly high stakes.
Ambitious, but necessary.
Right, and look at the partners involved. You had the DOE, a consortium of European energy firms. You had academic oversight from MIT and Zurich. This was not a black ops program in a basement in Nevada.
No, this was front page news.
The mission was to create a unified data protocol for deep-sea wind farms. Essentially, a way for the US and Europe to share renewable energy data in real time.
It sounds boringly legitimate.
That's the point. It was aggressively boring and aggressively legitimate. It had institutional validity. Independent experts were consulted to validate the premise.
And the funding was secured specifically to address a long-term problem.
And that phrase, long-term problem, that's the key to the vault, isn't it? Because once you label something long-term, you essentially write a blank check for patience.
Right. You're buying yourself a decade of runway.
Precisely. It signals to stakeholders and to taxpayers that this will take time. It involves research, infrastructure, significant capital. You aren't expected to show a profit in Q2 of 2012.
So initially, everything looks healthy. The sources show quarterly reports, glossy PDFs with wind turbines on the cover, smiling scientists in hard hats. It was presented as a success in progress.
Transparency, clear goals, expert validation. There were no red flags at the start. If you were a voter in 2013, you'd look at Meridian and think, this is government working as it should.
Okay, so we have the baseline. Legitimacy, ambition, money on the table. Now let's move into the operational phase. Because this thing ran for 10 years. This wasn't a startup that burned through its cash in 18 months.
No, this is the decade of growth. And this is where the story gets a little sticky. If you look at the operational period, say between 2014 and 2019, the project wasn't struggling.
It was expanding.
It was expanding.
I saw the staffing numbers in a 2016 mid-year review. They hired over 300 data scientists and oceanographers, opened a secondary facility in Halifax.
And look at the budget. The funding wasn't getting cut, it was increasing. In 2017, they got another $800 million grant for infrastructure hardening.
So it was weaving itself into the fabric of the institutions supporting it.
becoming a central hub. But hang on, you're telling me this ran for 10 years? Are we seriously saying that in a decade of audits, nobody raised a hand and said, hey, what are we actually getting for this?
How do you hide $1 billion of inefficiency in plain sight?
Well, that's the thing. They didn't hide it. They buried it in complexity. I found a 2018 audit report that explicitly states the results were mixed but promising.
Mixed but promising.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like what you say when you don't want to get fired.
In the world of long-term R&D, that phrasing is a shield. It means the science is hard, not that the management is bad. It means we're learning things, the data is complex, but we're moving forward.
It's a non-answer that satisfies the requirement for an answer.
It's a keep-going grade, not a failing grade. It's an incomplete. Nothing in those 10 years of reports suggested the project was in any real danger. The machinery of bureaucracy was working perfectly.
Reports were filed, fonts were chosen, meetings were catered.
The momentum was there.
Okay, so let's just pause and look at the picture. 10 years. Growing budget, growing staff, reports are filed, agencies are happy or at least content enough to keep signing the checks. And then, the turning point.
The fade.
The fade.
This is where the mechanics of silence really begin to turn.
It's startling because looking at the timeline you put together, there wasn't a specific kill date. No press conference, no spokesperson at a podium saying, Project Meridian is untenable, we're shutting it down.
No. That would be a failure. That would be a loud event. What happened here was a shift in atmosphere. It came with a cessation of updates.
Like a light slowly dimming.
That's a perfect way to put it. The dimmer switch was turned down.
So what were the signals? If I was a journalist tracking this in, say 2020 or 2021, what would I have seen?
First, the press updates stopped. The Meridian portal, which used to post weekly updates, switched to monthly, then quarterly. Then, in late 2020, the latest news section just froze.
It's like link rot, but for government spending. If the link is dead, did the money ever exist?
It's a valid comparison. Public references became less frequent in broader Department of Energy briefings. In 2015, Meridian was in every paragraph. By 2020, it was a footnote.
So people just stopped saying its name.
Essentially. And then the practical stuff. Reports that were once easy to download as a PDF, suddenly you had to request access via an admin portal.
That is a very specific kind of bureaucratic limbo.
Yeah.
Because internally, the work was still happening, right? People were still going to the office in Halifax.
Yes. Payroll records shows staff were still employed. Internally, the wheels were turning. But externally, the project was being taken off the stage. A total disconnect between the reality of the work and the visibility of it.
It's almost like they were preparing the audience for the disappearance by boring them into looking away first.
That's often how attrition works. Silence replaces visibility so gradually that when the final removal happens, fewer people even notice.
So let's talk about that final removal, the actual erasure, because eventually that dimmer switch went all the way down. Looking at the digital footprint today, in 2026, Meridian is basically a 404 error.
And this is where we have to be clear. This was an active bureaucratic act. This wasn't passive neglect. You don't accidentally scrub a terabyte of data.
What makes you say it was active?
Because web pages were taken down. Specifically, the entire meridian.gov subdomain was deprecated. If you click an old link from a 2019 report today, it just redirects you to the agency's generic About Us page.
Right. Someone had to click delete. Someone had to submit a ticket to IT to set up that redirect.
Exactly. And future funding rounds were never mentioned again. They didn't say funding is denied. They just stopped bringing it up.
This is the part that frustrates me. Where is the closure? I mean, usually, even if a project is a total disaster, you get a closing report, a lessons learned document.
Right. Even if it says, we burned $4 billion and all we got was this lousy t-shirt, it's still a document.
But here,
Nothing.
no closing report, no formal explanation, no public accounting of results. The 2022 fiscal year report for the department lists Meridian in the past initiatives appendix, but there's no summary of what it achieved.
Gone. The paper trail just stopped.
It creates a vacuum.
So what's left? What's the residue of a decade of work and $4.2 billion?
Fragments. That's the only word for it. We have references in old reports, mentions in meeting minutes from years ago, citations that don't have any context anymore because the source is now restricted.
It's like finding a footnote for a book that doesn't exist.
That is a perfect analogy. And if you try to reconstruct that book, you hit what researchers in this field call the human wall. The researchers involved, the 300 data scientists,
They're bound by confidentiality agreements, or they've just moved on. When you ask, they say, oh, that was wrapped up, and change the subject. And the officials, they redirect you to the archive department.
Please direct your inquiry to the Freedom of Information Act officer.
Right. Which takes 6 months to get a no.
Exactly. And over time, the inevitable happens. Interest fades. Not because the answer was found, but because asking just became too difficult. It's the attrition of interest.
So why? We have to ask the big question. Why go to these lengths to erase something that was, by all accounts, a legitimate project? Why not just say it didn't work?
Well, let's look at the standard reasons projects get erased. Usually it's one of three things. One, a very public failure. A bridge collapses, a rocket explodes. You want to hide the debris.
Okay.
Two, it becomes politically inconvenient. The administration changes, ideology shifts, and the green grid becomes a dirty word.
But the politics didn't change that drastically on this kind of tech during that time. No, it didn't. Which brings us to reason 3. The outcomes conflicted with expectations.
Okay, unpack that.
In this case, the evidence suggests it wasn't one catastrophic mistake. It wasn't that the technology failed spectacularly. It seems to be a diagnosis of uncomfortable mediocrity.
Uncomfortable mediocrity.
Think about it. If you spend $4 billion and the answer you get back is, this is slightly more efficient but not enough to change the world, what do you do with that result?
So we spent 10 years and a mountain of cash, and the answer we got was, heh.
Or the answer was, this is incredibly complicated and will cost another $20 billion to actually implement. It's a calculation of efficiency. And to admit that publicly is to admit the initial assessment was wrong.
So rather than standing up and saying, hey, everyone, we spent 10 years on this and the results are kind of lukewarm, they decided it was better to just say nothing at all.
That is the strategic decision. 10 years of funding does not vanish by accident. It disappears by decision. And the decision was likely that the conversation about the inefficiency was more damaging than the silence.
That's a powerful thought.
Inefficiency is much harder to explain to a voter than corruption. Corruption has a villain. Inefficiency is just waste.
So the silence was a strategic asset. If you cancel it loudly, you have to defend the cancellation. If you erase it quietly, nobody even asks the question.
What's fascinating is that the silence becomes the legacy. It becomes the only lasting product of the initiative.
It's like the cover-up is bigger than the crime, except there was no crime, just complexity.
Bureaucracies prefer clean narratives. Success or failure. Mixed but promising for 10 years is a very hard narrative to sell. So they erased it because it mattered too much to discuss openly.
It's incredible. We assume history is written by the victors, but here, history was just unwritten by the administrators. A sobering reminder of how fragile public memory is.
And that raises the most important question for all of us and for anyone listening who pays taxes or follows the news.
What's that?
If Project Meridian, a $4 billion, decade-long international initiative, can be erased this smoothly through bureaucracy and silence, how many other lost chapters of economic history are we currently unaware of, simply because we haven't noticed they're missing?
Wow.
How many other meridians are out there? Just 404 errors on a government server.
We might be walking past empty spaces on the shelf every day and not even realizing there used to be a book there.
We almost certainly are. The silent failures likely outnumber the loud ones 10 to 1.
Well, on that slightly unsettling note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. It's a reminder to keep looking, keep asking, and pay attention to what isn't being said.
Absolutely. Sometimes the silence is the loudest part of the transcript.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.